The night was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched across the highway and made even the smallest sound feel louder than it should. Two officers, patrolling their usual route, pulled into a dimly lit rest stop. The glow from the overhead lamps flickered faintly, casting long shadows on the empty parking lot. It was there they noticed him, a lone figure, sitting by his car, leaning slightly against the hood as though resting from a long drive. His clothes were simple, almost too plain for the late hour, and his posture gave off no sign of danger. Yet there was something about the stillness around him that caught their attention. He didn't move when their car pulled in, didn't look up immediately, and that quiet composure unsettled them. To the officers, people traveling at night usually had a reason: exhaustion, rushing home, or a restless mind, but this man seemed different. He looked tired, yes, but not like someone who had simply been driving too long. His silence was heavy, deliberate, and when the wind carried it across the lot, it pressed against them like a question they couldn't answer. The officers exchanged a quick glance, both thinking the same thing without saying a word. Something wasn't right here. They stepped out of their patrol car, their boots crunching softly on the gravel, the sound breaking the stillness. The man finally raised his eyes toward them, and for a fleeting moment, his gaze seemed calm, unshaken by their presence. He offered no wave, no sign of unease or welcome, just a steady look that revealed nothing. That expression only deepened their suspicions. Most people would react with surprise, maybe even irritation at being interrupted, but not him. He simply remained quiet, almost too quiet. As they approached, the closer details stood out. His car was spotless, no luggage visible, and his hands rested calmly on his knees, as though he had been expecting them all along. It was this lack of movement, this air of composure, that made the officers uneasy. They had seen many things in their years of service: nervous drivers, aggressive ones, fearful ones, but rarely someone who seemed untouched by the weight of being approached at night by law enforcement. "Evening, sir," one officer said, his voice carrying a cautious tone. The man nodded slightly, but his lips did not form words immediately. Instead, he seemed to study them, as though measuring each gesture, each sound. That brief pause stretched longer than it should have, and in those seconds, the officers felt an odd shift in the air, a tension that was hard to explain. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, low, and steady, but the words carried no details about why he was there. Just simple, polite answers that revealed nothing of his purpose. The more they questioned, the more his silence seemed to weigh on them, not because he was uncooperative, but because he was so composed, so unreadable. It was not the behavior of someone hiding in fear or guilt, but of someone who had no reason to be shaken. Yet that very calmness stirred their doubts. They could not place him, could not figure out why he was there. And in their world of instincts and training, the unknown was often the most dangerous thing of all. Standing under the cold light of the rest stop, with the quiet man before them, the night no longer felt routine, felt like the beginning of something they could not yet understand. The man's calmness should have been a sign that he had nothing to hide, but instead, it only made the officers uneasy. He answered every question politely, his tone even and his words clear. Yet the more composed he appeared, the more their doubts grew. In their experience, most people stopped at night by the police fumbled nervously for words, tried too hard to explain themselves, or showed visible irritation. But this man did none of that. He didn't flinch when their flashlights swept over him, didn't rush to defend himself, didn't complain about being questioned. His quiet patience, instead of reassuring them, began to feel unnatural, almost rehearsed. One officer asked for identification, and that was when the first crack in their confidence appeared. The man patted his coat slowly, then admitted he did not have it on him. It wasn't said with panic, nor with guilt, just a simple statement, but it was enough to change the air between them. No ID meant no certainty of who he was, No quick way to confirm his story, and that alone was enough to plant suspicion deep in their minds. In that moment, the man was no longer just a traveler resting at a lonely stop. He became someone unknown, someone they could not place, and in their line of work, that made him a risk. Their voices shifted. The polite questioning turned sharper, their eyes watching his every movement. One officer stepped a little closer, hand resting on his belt, not drawing his weapon but making the presence of authority clear. The other began circling slightly, glancing at the man's car, at the shadows behind him, at anything that might explain his presence. The man noticed the change but remained steady, his posture calm, his answers consistent. He explained he had been driving for hours, that he stopped to rest, that he was simply tired. But without proof in hand, his words sounded like stories to the officers, and stories were easy to invent. They began to treat him less like someone who needed rest, and more like someone hiding something. Every silence between their questions and his answers grew heavier. Every delay in his response twisted in their minds as hesitation. The night, already quiet, seemed to press against them, amplifying every doubt. Was he running from something? Was the car even his? Why here, at this empty rest stop, with no one else around? Their instincts sharpened with suspicion, and soon they were no longer looking for reassurance, they were searching for flaws in his calmness. Cracks in his story, signs that he was not who he claimed to be. One officer asked him to step away from the car, the command no longer a request, but an order. The man obeyed without argument, his movements measured, as though he understood the weight of every step. He kept his hands visible, not because they demanded it, but because he knew they already saw him as a possible threat. The officers exchanged glances again, their eyes carrying the unspoken agreement that something about this man did not sit right. He wasn't shouting, wasn't resisting, yet his refusal to show fear, his quietness in the face of suspicion, felt too controlled. To them, it was the behavior of someone trained, someone practiced, in holding back. What they didn't realize was that beneath that calm exterior lay a truth far larger than their assumptions, a truth that would soon shatter their certainty. But for now, in the dim light of the rest stop, all they saw was a man without an ID, too calm, too quiet, and therefore too dangerous to be trusted. The moment the officer reached for the handcuffs, the night seemed to grow heavier, as if the shadows leaned closer to watch. The man did not argue, did not fight, did not even try to explain further. He simply turned his wrists slightly, allowing the cold metal to snap shut around them. That single act of compliance was more unsettling to the officers than any struggle would have been. People accused wrongly often shouted, argued, or tried to pull away. Yet here was a man who behaved as if he had been expecting it all along, as though this scene was no surprise to him. His eyes lowered, not in defeat, but in a silence that carried weight, and that silence clung to the air thicker than any words could. One officer tightened his grip on the chain between the cuffs, testing the man's reaction, but there was no flinch, no shift of discomfort. He stood steady, shoulders square, his breathing calm, almost measured. The officer felt a strange unease coil inside him. It was not the usual resistance of a guilty man, it was something different, something that seemed to say, "You will regret this, but I will not stop you." The other officer, circling like a wary shadow, studied the man's face, trying to read what lay behind the lowered gaze. Was it shame? Was it resignation? Or was it something hidden, something that carried a quiet strength no uniform could intimidate? The man's stillness only fed their doubts. The empty parking lot stretched around them, silent except for the soft hum of their patrol car's engine and the distant rustle of trees. The night was so quiet that even the faint clink of the metal cuffs echoed in their ears, reminding them of the choice they had just made. One officer finally spoke, his voice sharp but wavering under the surface, demanding to know why the man had no ID, why he seemed so calm, why he didn't even attempt to explain himself now. The man lifted his head slowly, his eyes steady but unreadable, and answered with only a few words that were polite, soft, and without fear. Those words, too simple and too steady, only deepened the mystery. The officers exchanged quick glances, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt passed between them. Still, procedure pushed them forward. They decided he must be hiding something, that no ordinary traveler would accept handcuffs so easily. Perhaps he was used to being caught. Perhaps he was trained to endure questioning. Perhaps he was someone important to show his cards too soon. Each possibility churned in their thoughts, adding tension with every passing second. And yet, despite the heavy suspicion, the man's calm became the loudest thing in that rest stop. It unsettled them more than resistance ever could, because it felt like the silence before a storm, a silence that carried a truth they could not yet see, but would soon be forced to face. Just as the officers tightened their grip on the man, ready to escort him toward the patrol car, the stillness of the night was shattered by the sharp sound of a ringing phone. The sudden noise startled both men, its tone echoing in the empty rest stop like a bell that carried weight far beyond an ordinary call. It came from inside the man's car, faint but clear. The officers exchanged a glance, uneasy yet curious, and one of them, after a moment's hesitation, reached through the open window and grabbed the device. The screen lit up with an incoming call, and the name flashing across it was not what they expected. With caution, the officer slid his finger across the screen and lifted it to his ear. "Hello," he said in a clipped tone, his eyes flicking toward the man in cuffs. A firm, urgent voice crackled back through the speaker. "This is the courthouse, Can. I speak to Judge Daniels immediately. It's urgent." For a moment, time froze. The officer stiffened, his hand gripping the phone tighter, as his partner's eyes widened in disbelief. Judge Daniels. The words tangled in their minds, colliding with the image of the plain, quiet man standing before them in handcuffs. The officer on the phone stammered, unsure how to respond, while the voice on the other end grew sharper. "We need Judge Daniels right now. The hearing cannot proceed without him. Please put him on." A heavy silence hung between the officers as the truth began to press against their earlier assumptions. They turned toward the man, who had finally raised his eyes, calm but carrying a depth that neither officer had noticed before. It was not the gaze of a criminal or a wanderer. It was the gaze of someone used to authority, someone who carried the weight of decisions larger than theirs. The officer lowered the phone slowly, his mind racing, while his partner whispered under his breath, "What have we done?" The cuffs around the man's wrists suddenly felt too heavy, too wrong. The sound of the courthouse voice asking again for Judge Daniels rang in their ears like a judgment all its own. The man said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than anger ever could. In that moment, both officers realized the gravity of their mistake, not just a simple misunderstanding, but a dangerous assumption that had led them to humiliate a man who, in truth, held a position far higher than theirs. The confusion turned to unease, the unease to guilt, and yet the suspense of the moment still hung thick in the air. The courthouse voice had named him, but he had not yet confirmed it himself. And as the officers stood frozen in shock, the man simply lowered his gaze once more, allowing the weight of their realization to settle fully, leaving them with the chilling knowledge that the truth had been in front of them all along, and they had chosen not to see it. The tension at the rest stop was palpable, thick enough to feel like it could be cut with a knife, as both officers fumbled with the man's belongings once again, their hands trembling slightly from nerves, guilt, and the weight of uncertainty pressing on them. They opened his wallet more carefully this time, flipping through each compartment with a sense of dread building in their chests. And finally, hidden beneath a few credit cards and receipts, they saw at the ID they had overlooked in their earlier rush. It was official, crisp, and carried a seal that immediately silenced the officers' hearts. Their eyes locked onto the name, and a sudden, chilling realization washed over them. The man they had treated with suspicion, handcuffed without cause, and questioned as though he were an ordinary suspect, was, in fact, none other than Judge Daniels, the very judge assigned to oversee their department's upcoming review. The sheer weight of this truth hit them like a thunderclap. One officer's knees weakened slightly, and he gripped the edge of the patrol car for balance, his mind racing through every word, every motion, every assumption he had made in the last few minutes. How had they failed to notice? How had they let appearances and snap judgments guide their actions? The other officer stared at the ID, speechless, his throat dry, guilt pressing down like a heavy stone. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the distant hum of the freeway and the occasional rustle of leaves in the night wind. But inside that quiet, their hearts pounded in unison, echoing the enormity of their mistake. The judge remained calm, as if he had anticipated this moment, his face serene, eyes patient, and demeanor unshaken, carrying the quiet strength of someone who had long learned that judgment often revealed itself in actions, not words. The officer's thoughts tumbled over themselves, wondering how the man had endured the handcuffs, the suspicion, the cold and accusatory glances without losing his composure. Shame coursed through their veins, burning hotter than any anger or fear they had expected to encounter that night. They had underestimated him entirely, seeing only a tired traveler in plain clothes. And yet before them stood a figure of authority, respect, and power who could easily have made their professional lives much harder. One officer, finally finding his voice, muttered a shaky apology, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. The other simply nodded, unable to speak, as his mind replayed each mistake, each blink of inattention, each misjudged gesture. Judge Daniels' calm silence only magnified their errors, reflecting back to them their own assumptions, biases, and the consequences of acting without care. It was a moment of revelation that would stay with both officers forever, a harsh lesson in humility and human judgment, as they slowly realized that, in their haste and doubt, they had almost caused irreparable harm to someone they should have treated with utmost respect. The night air seemed heavier now, charged with the electricity of lessons learned the hard way, leaving the officers stunned, humbled, and painfully aware that appearances can deceive, and patience can reveal the truth in ways words cannot convey. The quiet that followed the discovery of Judge Daniels' identity was heavier than any words could carry, pressing down on the two officers as they stood frozen under the dim lights of the rest stop, the cool night air failing to ease the sudden weight in their chests. Every movement, every thought, seemed amplified as they realized the gravity of what they had done. The handcuffs, the suspicion, the questions, they had all been unnecessary, born not from evidence, but from assumptions and fear. And now the magnitude of their error unfolded before them in an unbearable clarity. The judge remained calm, sitting upright by his car, his posture unshaken, his hands folded neatly, as if nothing had happened. Yet every second of his quiet composure was a mirror reflecting back the officer's shame and self-reproach. His eyes, steady and unyielding, carried not anger or vengeance, but a deep, almost solemn disappointment that pierced through the haze of their professional arrogance. That silent gaze held more judgment than any words could express, teaching a lesson in humility that neither of them had expected to receive in such a stark, immediate way. The officers' minds raced through the encounter, replaying every movement, every hesitation, every subtle signal they had ignored, the man's calm responses, his composed body language, the patience he had maintained while being treated like a threat, all of which now spoke volumes about the disparity between perception and reality. One officer swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making speech nearly impossible, while the other kept shifting his weight, trying to find a place for his guilt that didn't exist. They were forced to confront not only the specifics of the situation, but also the underlying biases and assumptions that had guided their actions, recognizing how quickly fear and expectation can cloud judgment, even in trained law enforcement officers. Around them, the rest stop seemed unnervingly quiet. Every distant sound amplified, the rustle of leaves, a faraway car engine, the faint hum of streetlights, yet none of it could drown out the intensity of the moment or the silent admonishment of the man before them. Judge Daniel's presence was a living lesson, demonstrating that true authority and respect are carried through demeanor, integrity, and patience, not by the immediate force of one's title or by others' assumptions. The officers felt their previous confidence crumble as they faced the stark contrast between their own impulsive, fear-driven behavior and the judge's composed, principled response, understanding that their professional pride had blinded them to the human being in front of them. In that tense, suspended moment, words felt inadequate, apologies insufficient, and the weight of realization hung heavily over the scene. They finally grasped that humility is not weakness, and silence can speak louder than anger ever could, leaving an indelible mark on both of them that would shape every decision, every assumption, and every encounter from that night onward, forever reminding them that respect, patience, and careful observation are more valuable than force, suspicion, or haste. The weight of the evening still hung heavily over the quiet rest stop as the two officers, faces flushed with shame and minds racing with regret, finally found the courage to speak, their voices low and unsteady as they offered sincere apologies to the man they had so wrongly judged. Each word felt inadequate, each syllable carrying the burden of their hastiness. Yet the act of acknowledgement was a small but essential step toward understanding the depth of their mistake. Judge Daniels, still composed, accepted their apologies with a measured calm that both disarmed and humbled them further. His presence radiated a quiet authority, not the kind that demanded fear or compliance, but the kind that inspired reflection and recognition of one's own flaws. He reminded them gently, almost as if teaching a lesson they had not only learned, but had been too blind to see until now. That respect should not be measured by the clothes someone wears, the place they sit, or the outward impressions they create. Instead, true respect springs from recognizing humanity itself, the inherent value and dignity that every person carries, regardless of circumstance. The officers shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, feeling the sting of their assumptions, how quickly and carelessly they had allowed suspicion to override judgment, how easily they had let bias dictate their actions, and how narrowly they had missed violating the principles of fairness and decency they were sworn to uphold. In that still night, the hum of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves around the rest stop seemed to amplify the intensity of the moment, turning it into a quiet arena of moral reckoning. The judge spoke of patience and observation, emphasizing that an individual's composure, choices, and actions often reveal more about their character than any superficial measure could ever show. He described how the world is often quick to judge based on fear, misunderstanding, or incomplete information, and how a single moment of caution, or lack thereof, can alter the course of trust, reputation, and human interaction. As the officers listened, they began to feel the slow, almost painful unraveling of their arrogance, replaced by a new awareness that their duty extended beyond protocol. It encompassed the careful assessment of situations, the suspension of bias, and the acknowledgement of each person's intrinsic worth. The judge's tone never wavered into reproach, yet every word carried weight, embedding itself into the officer's consciousness, transforming the encounter from a simple routine stop into a profound lesson in ethics and empathy. Their hearts, heavy with remorse, were also opening to understanding a recognition that their roles as enforcers of law came with responsibility not just to follow rules, but to honor the humanity of those they encountered. By the end of their exchange, the officers had absorbed a crucial truth, that humility, respect, and attentiveness matter far more than fear, assumption, or haste, and that each interaction, no matter how brief or seemingly routine, offers an opportunity to act with dignity and honor in the soft glow of the rest stop's lights. As the night wrapped around them, the lesson settled firmly within them, a memory that would guide every decision, every glance, and every judgment they would make from that night onward, forever reminding them that true authority is earned through understanding, patience, and recognition of the human spirit. From that quiet, tense night at the rest stop, a ripple of change began to flow through the department, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each day and each encounter, as the two officers carried the weight of what they had learned deep within themselves, forever marked by the experience of misjudging a man whose calm composure and quiet dignity had spoken volumes about patience, humanity, and the consequences of assumptions. In the days that followed, conversations among colleagues shifted. The story of that late-night encounter traveled through the precinct, not as gossip or ridicule, but as a listener reminder that every interaction, every stop, and every decision held the power to impact lives far beyond the immediate moment. The officers who had once acted hastily and with suspicion now approached their work with a newfound mindfulness, carefully observing, listening, and considering before acting, understanding that fairness and respect are not optional traits, but essential components of justice. They began to notice small things, the hesitant gestures of a traveler, the nervous tone in a voice, the subtle signs that could speak more truth than a single assumption ever could. Their approach to policing changed from one driven by routine and quick judgment to one guided by awareness, empathy, and patience. Each case, each call, and even routine traffic stops became an opportunity to practice the lesson. They had learned the importance of seeing beyond appearances, of respecting the humanity in every person, and of remembering that one wrong assumption could shatter trust in an instant. In meetings and briefings, they recounted the story carefully, not to boast, but to ensure that the lesson endured, that newer officers understood the gravity of their responsibility and the fragile nature of the trust placed in them by the public. The tale of the man at the rest stop, initially so ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in character, became a guiding principle within the department, that authority carries with it the burden of restraint, observation, and moral clarity, and that the greatest impact often comes not from the loud, visible actions, but from the quiet, careful choices made when no one is watching. Even as months and years passed, the memory of that night remained vivid, etched in the minds of the officers as a turning point, a moment when their perspective shifted forever. They began to mentor younger colleagues with patience, emphasizing that justice is intertwined with understanding, that respect is not given lightly but recognized through actions that honor the dignity of every individual, and that mistakes, once realized, must serve as catalysts for change rather than sources of shame alone. In every stop they made, every routine check, and every unexpected encounter, they carried the echo of that night, the calm eyes of the man they had wrongly judged, the silence that held more power than any reprimand, and the quiet, transformative lesson that one act of fairness, one moment of recognizing the truth in another person, could indeed change lives. And so, the department, once just a collection of officers following protocol, evolved into a place where mindfulness, empathy, and humanity guided decisions, ensuring that the impact of that single encounter at a lonely rest stop continued to resonate, shaping not just careers but the moral compass of an entire team, reminding them daily that true authority is measured not by fear or speed, but by fairness, respect, and the courage to see beyond first impressions.